Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Finding Jimmy Moran, Codicil to the Claire Trilogy, by Tom Mccaffrey. Narrated by Joe Barrett. Prologue. Hindsight is 20/20. They say that when you are dying, your whole life flashes before your eyes. That was true in my human form, for I actually died twice. The first time occurred when I was 4 human years and swallowed that damn copper penny. It got wedged in my throat and shut off my oxygen for the 20 minutes it took my frantic mother to get me to the emergency room of the closest hospital. That retrospective was a bit of a rip-off, given that there was not much to remember at the time, except Kathy Brown, her pigeons, and her delightful pecks. I guess that was enough. The second and last time I died as a human, I ingested copper in a different shape, when that 9mm bullet created a new opening in my body and pierced my heart. Turns out that, too, was a rip-off, because while by then I had 6 decades of memories to draw upon, I was only playing the edited version of that life. The last thing I remembered then was my wife Gina, and that, too, was enough. It still is. But as the last of the first group of Centaurian-Terran hybrids, I owe it to all those who have come after, and those humans and other mystical species on Earth and other planets, including Claire, who all followed us into the Great Galactic War, to take this opportunity to get this one right. Because this time is my last time. The 24-second clock has been turned off, and I want that ball in my hands because I'm taking this last shot. The good news is that the Centaurian evolutionary upgrade following my second human demise slowly restored that portion of my human memory that had been wiped clean, and I've had the last 450 years to get this straight. I've kept this recovered part of the first 2 decades of my human existence locked away from everyone, including Gina, and I am sure I am going to have some explaining to do once I reach that other side of the veil. I opened my eyes and gazed over at my 2 children, Stella and Apollo, the present rulers of Proxima B, who sat beside me stoically, absorbing my thoughts. They were beautiful. So I am sharing this memory with you both, to do with it whatever you think best. This is my director's cut. In English, Father, I don't want anything lost in translation. Stella was indeed her mother Petrichor's daughter. All business, no bullshit. And I want you to say it out loud. I want to hear your voice when I remember it. Apollo smiled, and for a moment I saw Gina in his face. I nodded. Make yourselves comfortable, I said softly, my voice a bit raspy from age and lack of use. This may take a while. I got all the time in the universe, came a disembodied husky voice, followed by that lurchy laugh. A moment later, my magnificent mule, Claire, appeared before us in her holographic form. She nuzzled Stella and Apollo, then reclined beside my chair and lay her large head across my lap. I stroked her beautiful mane and thought for a moment of all of the adventures we had shared. She smiled as she read those thoughts. So, let us begin. Chapter 1. Moving Uptown. The last thing I remember about Girard Avenue that morning in early January of 1960, as my father pulled his packed 1957 Chevy station wagon away from the curb, was staring out the car's back window at the large green eyes of Kathy Brown, who removed her right glove to wave as she watched the car take my family a short distance south, before finally making a left and climbing 161st Street towards the Grand Concourse. I caught one final look at the old Yankee Stadium through the frost of my breath on the window as we made that turn north onto the Jewish Riviera and headed to our new home in the Promised Land, Riverdale. The car was as cold inside as out, its vintage air heating system just powerful enough to de-ice the windshield and warm the legs of the passengers in the front seat. The rest of us had to rely on the body warmth from the close proximity of our nearest family member or pet. Thank God we had a decent number of bodies to keep the rest of us from freezing to death. I never had been further north than this wide Bronx boulevard than Alexander's department store on Fordham Road, where my mother used to take the tribe to clothe us twice a year for Easter and Christmas. I remember its slogan, "You'll find Alexander's has what you're looking for. How lucky can you get?" I guess that made us pretty lucky. "Edgar Allan Poe lived there," my mother exclaimed while pointing generally in the direction of a passing park on her right. My mother was a brilliant woman, who unfortunately had to sacrifice advancing to college once she married and started having children. Despite the lack of formal education, she, like her father before her, was a voracious reader. So she was as smart as the Scarecrow in The Wizard of Oz. She just never got the paperwork to prove it. At 4 years old, I had no clue about Edgar Allan Poe, and so I didn't bother looking. My older and only sister, Bonnie, who had a few years of grammar school at Christ the King under her belt, must have recognized the name, as she strained her neck to her right to catch sight of the top of the small cottage my mother was referring to. Bonnie was the perfect child, a parent's joy, until she later shed the limitations of our Catholic faith in both doctrine and practice. I was already bored, so I rolled over towards my next younger brother, the Ginger, caught his head between my two knees, and gently tapped him on the nose with my fist. This always had the same effect. His freckled face scrunched up like the petals of a red rose, and he started to wail uncontrollably. I liked to think that I was doing my younger brother a favor back then. It toughened him up, and when his Viking genes finally kicked in during his teenage years, it made him an absolute killer, the type that Led Zeppelin later sang about in its 1972 hit Immigrant Song. He gave Eric the Red a run for his money. "What the fuck's going on back there?" my father shouted through the cloud of Marlboro smoke enveloping him in the driver's seat. "Eddie, leave your brothers alone," my repeatedly pregnant mother shouted from the passenger seat beside her husband. Secondary smoke wasn't an issue back then. "It was Jimmy," my older brother shouted back before rifling a right fist into my left shoulder, propelling me against the right back window and freeing the struggling Ginger, who quickly scooted from the cargo space over the back of the middle seat like a crab and into the protective arms of my sister Bonnie. "You keep it up and I'm going to pull over and put you all out on the street," my father responded. "I'll rent your rooms in the new house to some of the neighborhood urchins." My father was always threatening to put us out on the roadway whenever we acted up in the car. He really had no other hand to play, given that the most troublesome of his children learned early on that riding prone in the storage section of all the station wagons he drove until he died meant that he could not reach us when he flailed blindly into the back seat behind him, looking to strike one of the offenders. That frantic movement always set off the bursitis in his right shoulder, which led to a litany of curses I can still recite from memory. For my father, it was always safety first when he was driving. He never took his eyes off the roadway, unless it was to light a cigarette. By now we had reached the northernmost end of the Grand Concourse. I found this fascinating because in my short life I had never come to the end of the road before. Turns out it was the first of many of such experiences, both figuratively and literally. Just one more end of the road in this lifetime. Not even Maccombs Park had as many trees as I saw lining the Mosholu Parkway, which formed the next leg of our journey towards the family forever home. Mosholu means hidden river in some local Indian language, my mother announced, pointing at the road sign as we turned onto the roadway. "Our new house is on Mosholu Avenue." It took us all a few tries, but we soon converted our first attempt at Mashallah to Mosholu through group repetition led by Bonnie, who knew her calling early on and later became a teacher of the rich and mighty. I never got used to saying that word. By then my father had followed the winding roadway through a large forested area my mother identified as Van Cortlandt Park before we finally arrived at the exit sign number 22 for 254th Street and Riverdale Avenue. One more block and my father pulled in front of a large green and white three-family house set up from and back off the sidewalk behind a retaining wall and a line of bushes. "Home sweet home," my dad shouted proudly, and he raced the station wagon through the narrow stone opening to the driveway like he had boat bumpers on the sides of his car. At the end of a long driveway stood my paternal grandparents. Posy, whose given name was Rose, was a petite woman with that silver-blue hair that was fashionable at that time, and the most beautiful blue-gray eyes this side of heaven. I'm not sure she broke 5 feet in height or 100 pounds. She was adorned with her chef's apron, which meant she had arrived long enough before us to cook a full lunch for the family. She had a warm wool shawl tossed around her shoulders to temporarily ward off the January cold. Since Posy had arrived in America from her home in Northern Ireland, she had worked as the cook for the wealthy titans of industry that lived in the doorman buildings and brownstones that dotted Manhattan's Upper East Side. Recently retired, she had agreed to join my parents in buying the Riverdale house, where she spent the rest of her days making sure that her grandchildren lived until adulthood. That was a full-time job. Next to her stood my grandfather, Big Eddie, a moniker given to the eldest of the 3 generations of Edward in his family line. Within 3 years, my yet-to-be-born youngest brother would have mangled that name into Spaghetti, which was quickly adopted by the entire neighborhood for as long as I lived there, and I'm sure continuing as myth until this day. Spaghetti was not particularly tall, but had broad shoulders and massive forearms, like the cartoon character Popeye the Sailor Man, that were developed over his earlier life as a farmer and patriot in Northern Ireland, then as a steel laborer for many years in Todd's shipyard in Brooklyn, and finally as the superintendent for a row of tenements on 109th Street. He was built like a large orangutan, and his appropriately ginger hair had long ago turned white. There wasn't a piece of furniture or appliance that Spaghetti could not lift single-handedly, and he could walk comfortably while carrying us all in his arms and hanging on his shoulders and back. He was the man the tenants in his buildings called when they needed something carried up the dark stairs of the tenement. For an elderly man, he had amazingly quick fists, which he often unexpectedly delivered to the softest spots on his grandsons just to toughen us up. Spaghetti hadn't yet retired, and held a coveted gig as the evening doorman of a luxury townhouse right by the Guggenheim Museum off Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. Irish doormen were de rigueur on the Upper East Side, as their innate bruteness guaranteed added security for the building's occupants. If you had a soft brogue, it made the wasps that lived there feel just a little more entitled as they passed you holding open their doors or umbrellas as you ferried them from the building to the waiting cab, or vice versa. But Spaghetti never said a bad word about the people he served at his building. And they always tipped him well, especially around Christmas. He was the role model that taught his grandchildren how to suck it up and get on with living. It was his second job as a doorman, on top of his super's job, which allowed him to scrape together my grandparents' share of the down payment for this new Riverdale home. Spaghetti was wearing a pair of gray wool slacks, held up by suspenders stretched tightly over the massive shoulders of his upper long johns, both sleeves rolled up to the elbows. Spaghetti was impervious to the cold, although he wore one of those Canadian ear-flap hats to protect the top of his balding head and oversized ears from frostbite and winter sun. Posy now threw open the passenger side door of the car, and after assisting my mother to her feet, called to Bonnie, who flew out of the car and wrapped her granny in a bear hug. "Quick, come in before you catch your death of cold," Posy commanded. The 3 women then turned on their heels and headed through the backyard and into the first-level back door. My father grabbed a few suitcases out of the back of the station wagon and followed closely on their heels. As we boys tumbled out of the vehicle and went to race after them, hoping to get at that meal we could smell wafting from the kitchen, Spaghetti snatched Eddie and me by our coat collars and lifted us off our feet while the Ginger scooted past him for want of a third arm. The Ginger mastered those same evasive skills over the years that followed until one day he didn't. "Where do you feckin' idiots think you're going?" he bellowed, steam firing out of both nostrils like a dragon. Given that we were both being yoked by our collars, neither Eddie nor I were able to respond past the blobs of saliva now rolling off our extended tongues. I could feel mine freezing as we hung there. "That's what I thought," he said, hurling us back in the direction of the station wagon like a couple of stuffed rabbits. "Grab some of that gear and carry it inside," he said, giving me an extra boot in the pants for good measure. "There's no skivers in this family." Eddie saw the writing on the wall, quickly grabbed as many of the bags as he could carry, and half-dragged them in the direction of the house. "But I'm only 4," I shouted back at my grandfather defiantly. "And if you want to see 5, you'll do what you're told," he shouted back at me. I could see the rope-like muscles in his forearms begin to dance above his knotted fists. I spit in silent protest to my involuntary servitude, and to jettison my frozen spittle before grabbing a couple of the bags and dragging them after the others. Spaghetti playfully cuffed my ear as I passed him. "That tongue is going to get you in some serious trouble someday," he said with a laugh. "I hope I'm alive to see it." Despite my facile wit and the preternatural charm I developed shortly afterwards once I swallowed that penny, I never won an argument with Spaghetti from that moment onward. Chapter 2. The Ginger's First Irish Exit. I was raised in a Catholic household. You've all studied Earth's great religions, even though it was just moments by binary download, so I won't bore you with its dogma, which was recorded back in the day by a simple patriarchal society. They did the best they could with what they had. Understand that I believe that Jesus was a child of God, as I define a creator that is pure love and has unlimited power, and that all those millennia ago, this unique man evolved through his own efforts and maybe a bit of divine intervention to the highest of energy states. He transcended his humanity and fully harnessed the gifts our creator of all the stars and planets in the heavens has offered to all of those that believe in themselves as the legacy of the creator. Luke chapter 17, verses 20 to 21. God's kingdom is coming, but not in a way that you will be able to see with your eyes. People will not say, "Look, here it is," or "There it is," because God's kingdom is within you. Jesus knew his shit. He did it old school. No one had to zap him with a Hadron distributor. The rest of the Terrans have all been playing catch-up for centuries. That being said, my childhood was scheduled around my Catholicism. The Irish leaped from one feast day to the next, each a temporary pause in the struggles and misery of daily human existence. The Irish in particular enjoyed the pomp and circumstance that the Catholic Church served up throughout each year on a regular basis. By keeping their eyes focused on that next big holy day, it was easier to ignore what was really happening around them on a day-to-day basis. My concept of my religion was far less altruistic. I was not worried about redemption, and did not believe that my Creator put me on the earth just to suffer and repent over the pleasures I experienced in the body I was given. I did not believe that my Creator would punish me with eternal damnation and hellfire because of failures caused by inherent defects in the tools I was provided with when I arrived on the earth. I still believe in the golden rule: treat others as you want to be treated, but after that, everything else is negotiable. Do your best with what you have. Even now, as I await my passage across the veil, I do not fear retribution. "Well, lucky for you, there isn't any," Claire said, "or you'd have some answering to do." She winked at Stella and Apollo. I chose to ignore her. I was on a roll. Back in the day, I used to really enjoy Easter. Next to Christmas and birthdays, it was the one day you woke up and there was a present waiting for you. An Easter basket full of jelly beans, marshmallow peeps, and a giant chocolate bunny. There was always a stuffed toy rabbit with fake and often colorful fur in the basket, which each child then protected with his life. I always felt that Easter basket grass was a static annoyance comparable to Christmas tinsel. It clung to you, got everywhere, and some always ended up in your mouth. During the lead-up to the annual Easter feast day, our parents always took the children out to update our Sunday finery. With new suits and shoes, which were all put on display before the neighborhood at Easter Sunday High Mass. The mothers in the neighborhood all trotted out their new Easter bonnets, back when women wore hats to church. Young girls wore white paper or cloth doilies bobby-pinned to their hair. This was the early 1960s, at the time of the Tridentine Mass, when the Catholic High Mass, Missa Cantata or Sung Mass, was celebrated with all its ostentatiousness. High Mass in the Catholic holy days was the place the Irish Catholics wanted to be seen. There was always more than one priest on the altar, usually led by the Monsignor, and a ton of altar boys, the church having not yet evolved to sharing the altar with the feminine form. My older brother and I were both tossed out of that altar boy cult on the same day, minutes apart, by the Monsignor, the purple priest. "Are you a champ or a chump?" were the last words the prick ever said to me. I would not have minded the summary dismissal if I hadn't sacrificed so many Saturday mornings, when I should have been watching cartoons, instead being drilled in Latin by my religiously imperious father, Confidior Deo Omnipotenti. This was pre-Vatican II. Anyway, after my family first moved up to Riverdale from the Grand Concourse by Yankee Stadium, we spent the first few months living in the basement apartment of the family home, while the Jewish family living on the top floor found a new apartment. Posy and Spaghetti lived on the first floor with my sister Bonnie, who had her own room. The rest of the children lived in steerage. During the wee morning hours on our first Easter in Riverdale, a time before the older children were even enrolled in the local parish, St. Maggie's Catholic School, my still wee little brother, the Ginger, wearing his footy pajamas, grabbed his new faux fur bunny, put on my mother's Easter bonnet, and toddled out the basement side door and into the unknown world, while the rest of the family dozed peacefully in their crowded bedrooms. Now, that was the first time the Ginger made an Irish exit. When a human leaves a place without saying goodbye to the people they are with, a trick which later morphed into a coyote escape, when a now sober person with buyer's remorse will literally chew off their limb trapped under a pillow to escape a drunk one-night stand without waking their partner. I am not being sexist here. Many a young man, including me, when I was both young and a human man, has welcomed to find the severed arm left by a much prettier woman who sacrificed that appendage rather than face the snoring, farting bastard she woke up next to. Luckily for both sexes, like a bearded dragon's tail, those limbs always grew back before the owner's next foray into bar dating. But I digress. The Ginger ultimately mastered all forms of a magician's escape without ever using magic. His cunning was pure genius. Indeed, during our teenage years, we, the Ginger's siblings, called him the Wind. He would always step away from a family table and excuse himself to go to the bathroom, which was in the hallway just outside and opposite the dining room. There was a closet in the same hallway that, when its door was open, would obscure that passage from my father's vantage point at the head of the dinner table. The Ginger always made a fuss about selecting some toiletry from that closet before he went into the bathroom, and always left the closet door open. By the time the sound of the toilet flush had run its course, the Ginger had vanished with the wind. Anyway, back to that morning in 1960. Like with most holidays, on Easter, the children woke up first, so we could grab our respective baskets based on the name tags on the curved wicker handles. My eldest sibling, Bonnie, would arbitrate all the challenges with a sound thumping if there were any battles among her brothers over the size or amount of the contents of the baskets. She was the only one of us who could read at this time, and she was still bigger and stronger than all of the boys. Anyway, while we all sat around the living room chomping on jelly beans and chocolate, working on the bellyaches we would later suffer, my exhausted parents sleepwalked past us into the kitchen and then returned moments later with their hot coffees to watch the Easter chaos from the comfort of the couch, still half asleep. It was a good half hour before my slowly waking pregnant mother said, "Where's Bernie?" My father looked over at the Ginger's basket, noticed the newest velveteen rabbit missing, and responded, "He must have gone back to bed. I'll check on him." My father then disappeared in the direction of the bedrooms. The next moment we heard my father's panicked, booming voice reverberating throughout the structure of the building. "Vera! "Bernie's not here!" My mother flew in the direction of the bedrooms, where she began to shriek like a banshee. Moments later, the back door flew open, and my grandfather, Spaghetti, rushed in, dressed in a pair of sailcloth long johns, with a 2-button poop chute on the ass, his untied work boots, and his beaten gray fedora. He was carrying his faithful Hurley, a Celtic bladed wooden bat that could smack a small leather ball hundreds of feet and crack the skull of any man. Posy's head appeared from behind him. She was dressed in her nightgown and the fine netting she always wore to keep her silver-blue hairdo in check. "Jesus Christ!" Spaghetti bellowed. "Barrett, you've woken the dead!" At 4 years old, I wasn't sure in that moment whether Spaghetti was the dead or whether there were now a cluster of spirits floating around the apartment above us. Turns out years later it was both. Posy pushed past her husband and raced into the bedrooms, where my parents had by now overturned every bed and cleared every closet looking for the ginger. "He's not here!" my mother shrieked. "Calm down, Vera, you'll give yourself a heart attack," counseled Posy. "We'll find him." "Are you all idiots?" Spaghetti shouted. "The side door is open." With that, all 4 of the adults rushed out through the side door onto the driveway, and we could hear their voices, calling my brother's name, grow fainter as their searches expanded from the yard onto the surrounding block. Seeing how Bonnie was distracted by the commotion, my older brother and I decided that if the ginger didn't want his Easter candy, it was up for grabs. Of course, that led one of our earliest Riverdale Donnybrooks, as we both reached for his chocolate bunny at the same moment. Fists followed. I lost then, and in every rematch we ever had. My older brother and I may have been still locked in that fight to the death if it weren't for the annoying sound of a police siren rolling up our driveway. Bonnie, Eddie, and I raced out the side door and just got to the top of the cement stairway as the police cruiser, one of those iconic black and whites with the one flashing red cherry light on top, came to a stop at the top by the garage. Like a pack of dogs, the elder McCarthys came racing up the driveway in the cherry top's wake, my mother with a look of horror on her face. 2 very tall policemen exited the front seats of the cruiser. I swear they looked like Tootie and Muldoon from a popular television show at the time, Car 54, and the Tootie cop then opened the back door of the vehicle, crooked his finger, and a moment later the ginger, Easter bonnet tilted back on his head and velveteen bunny in tow, slid out of the back seat and rushed into my mother's arms. The Muldoon copper warily eyed Spaghetti, still in his long johns and boots and reflexively waving his Hurley menacingly. "Is this boy yours?" Muldoon asked, with just a little trepidation in his voice. "Yes, officer, he's ours," my father said, as he stepped forward and gave the officer a hearty handshake. "I'm sorry for the trouble." Muldoon winced. Given the McCarthy code for handing out handshakes, I was surprised my father wasn't arrested for assault right then and there. "Where did you find him?" Posy asked. "We didn't," Tootie responded. "A cab driver spotted him walking along Marshalloo, right down the hill from your house. He picked him up and brought him to the 50th. We put him in the cruiser and figured we would drive around to see if anyone was looking for him." Muldoon added, still shaking blood back into his hand. "The little bugger pointed to this house," Tootie said. By now the neighbors all started to appear at the foot of the driveway. That might have been the first of many times that the McCarthy household became the source of neighborhood entertainment. Those were simpler but more practical times back then. Police were allowed to solve local problems as human beings and not as cogs in a bureaucracy. Today the ginger would have ended up in a stint with the local government's child services, while my parents were put through their paces to get him back. Anyway, their job done, the coppers left, the neighbors disbanded, and the McCarthys got their shit together and attended High Mass in all of our Easter finery. Chapter 3. A Penny Drops. Before our move to Riverdale, I was not cognizant of the concept of personal property beyond the confines of the loosely drawn lines between what was individually owned or communally shared among my male siblings. Clothes were temporarily assigned based upon your size, and then passed on to the next in line. Toys often followed the same demarcation system, although that ownership never changed hands based on biology alone. The McCarthy boys hung onto their prize toys, until it actually became too embarrassing to publicly assert ownership over the item. My sister lived under a separate set of property rules. As the only girl in the family, she had her own room.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?